Hi, I'm Amy Hines from Retail NZ, the Manager of Public Affairs and Advice. Welcome to our single-use plastics Q&A with Daisy Croft, Senior Policy Analyst from the Ministry for the Environment. From 1st of July, certain single-use plastics have been banned or restricted under the second tranche of the government's phase-out of problematic plastics. Plastics is one of our greatest environmental challenges, and these bans will prevent more than 2 billion items going to landfill every year. Today, Daisy will address some common questions to help you understand the bans, ensure compliance, and prepare for any future bans. Thanks for being here today, Daisy. Can I get you to start off by explaining to us a little bit about your role at the Ministry for Environment?
Sure. Kia ora, really lovely to be here. So I'm Daisy Croft and I work in our waste streams policy team at the Ministry for the Environment, which sits within our broader waste and resource efficiency division. For me, that's mainly involved working over the last few years on our bans on single-use and hard to recycle plastics, as well as working alongside our Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade colleagues on New Zealand's participation in international plastics negotiations.
Perfect. Thanks, Daisy. Now, the nitty-gritty of the details of these single bans on plastic use bans and the restrictions. I mean, having you here makes it easier for business and consumers to understand. So if we go through a couple of questions on those key topics, that would be helpful. Can you start off with a quick overview of what's included in this area of the ban, or tranche of the ban, as you guys call it?
From the 1st of July 2023, so just last month, the government banned or restricted single-use plastic produce bags, so those provided and used to pack fresh fruit and vegetables at the place of sale, as well as single-use tableware, so plastic plates, bowls and cutlery. Plastic straws, single-use plastic straws will only be allowed for people with a health or disability condition, and produce labels have also begun kind of a two-phase transition to becoming fully home compostable by mid-2025. And with the exception of those fully home compostable produce labels, all those other single-use bans but include compostable, recyclable, biodegradable or plant-based plastic alternatives. So, and there's also more information on the Ministry for the Environment's website on each of those items. So encourage everyone to check out the Ministry's website for further information around those as well.
Yeah, in Retail NZ, we've obviously got a bit of a partnership with you guys with some work, and we've got some information on there as well, and can go over those things for that. But if we get into it, because I think that kind of can be a bit overwhelming with what do those things mean. But if we get into some specifics of things, you mentioned the ban includes produce bags used to pack fresh fruit and vegetables. Are other plastic bags included?
So the produce bags that are provided and used to pack fresh fruit and vegetables at the place of sale are included in the ban. But just to be really clear, the ban doesn't include animal waste bags or bin liners or pre-packed produce. So you think of like your bags of potatoes or apples or even herb plastic sleeves. Those sorts of things aren't included in the ban. And it also doesn't apply to other fresh or cooked produce, things like bread, meat, fish or bulk bin foods with your nuts and things like that aren't included in that produce bag ban. And just as I mentioned before, though, the ban on the fresh fruit and vegetables produce bags, that does include compostable and biodegradable alternatives. And of course, in addition to the July 2023 ban, everyone will remember, I'm sure, that back in 2019, the government also banned plastic shopping bags. So everyone's done a lot of work to switch to reusable alternatives in the plastic shopping bags.
And I guess that's the point, right? That was the first stage, and we've kind of come to grips with that. So we're in this next transition for what goes on. So in regards to cutlery, does the ban include all cutlery, such as serving utensils or packaged cutlery?
Yes, so the ban includes cutlery that is integral to the packaging of a food product. So that might look like cutlery that's sold with noodles or yogurt bottles. in case it's useful to clarify this, things like serving utensils, so that might be like tongs or cake servers, those aren't included in the ban. These tend to be used in kind of catering and those sorts of settings where they do tend to be reused rather than single-use items that commonly end up as litter.
Yeah, and I know as a mum who, kids' parties, there is alternatives. So you don't have to go down the plastic things, and most retailers have those already on the market in that sense of things. So speaking of parties and kids, plastic straws, they're now being restricted. Are you able to expand on what this means?
Oh yeah, of course. So supermarkets, pharmacies, hospitality businesses like cafes and restaurants, education facilities, and some health and disability support services. These places can still provide plastic straws to people with a disability or with a health condition. If they do choose to stock plastic straws, they must not be on display, but they can be provided upon request. And people who do have that need to access straws don't have to provide proof of their disability or health condition. They can request those, but those are the circumstances in which plastic straws can still be purchased or accessed.
And I mean, there's some great paper straw alternatives or metal straw alternatives all on the market for people to use in place of that.
That's right.
So to assist businesses, if they're trying to figure out if items are included or not, how are businesses able to tell if the item is made from plastic?
Yeah, great question. It is tricky, but as a good rule of thumb, if an item looks or feels like plastic or behaves like plastic, it is most likely to be plastic. So things like compostable plastic, recyclable, biodegradable, or plant-based plastic alternatives, these are all banned items. Obviously, as I mentioned a bit earlier on, with the exception of that transition to the fully home compostable produce labels. A common bioplastic that people might see as a common alternative is PLA.
I mean, yeah, look, you've mentioned a couple of times because it can get a bit confusing, right? You've got compostable, you've got plant-based, you've got biodegradable products, and they're all included in the ban. What are the reasons for this?
Yeah, it's a really good question. This is a tricky space, that shift to alternatives, and yeah. So in New Zealand, most compostable plastics items, they don't actually end up in the correct composting system. This is largely because we don't in New Zealand we don't really have collection processing facilities for compostable plastics, and in general they present a risk to composters of contamination in their compost, which could affect the quality of the end result. So most compostable plastics actually end up in landfill or littered in the environment. And when they end up in landfill, they produce the potent greenhouse gas methane, or when they're littered, they tend to just behave like conventional plastic when they end up in the environment. Or they also can end up as contamination in our recycling system. So at the moment, compostable plastics present all these sorts of challenges to us. And like I say, even if they did end up in a composting facility, they may not be accepted due to the risks of contamination and the possible impacts that could have on the soil and the food chain. So if anyone's really interested in this topic, the ministry released just last year a position on the use of compostable products in New Zealand and how we're thinking about how they could play a role in a circular economy in New Zealand. And that role is quite defined, quite limited to a few very specific situations, but in general, we recommend proceeding with caution. So something that might give people a flavour for why those have been included in these bans.
I think it's a really great example, Daisy, of that concept between something maybe plant-based and what we think a definition of plant-based, or what we think a definition of compostable when we're using these kind of products and what their label is. It is actually totally different definitions, hence why that approach in regards to what's going on there. I think it's a really good thing from our work around in the environmental space and phase outs in regards to bringing that kind of, putting that standard in place in that sense of things. But similar to knowing, because I mean, that's the thing, you don't know if it's plastic or not. How can a business tell whether the item there is single use or reusable in the sense of things?
Yeah, another really great great question, and is really core to the success of these phase outs. So the regulations themselves, they define single use as an item that is designed to be used once or a limited number of times before being thrown away. That is quite a broad description. So some questions that people might want to consider when thinking through whether something is single use is, for example, is the item ordinarily supplied in a context where it's likely to be used once and then disposed of? So, for example, cutlery or plates used to consume food at a market or in a food court where it cannot be easily returned and be washed and reused. Or is the item supplied free or at low cost or in bulk? Those sorts of things might give you a better feel for whether the item is intended or is likely to be used as a single-use item or not. There's also a diagram available on the ministry's website, which I mentioned the website a bit earlier, and that diagram is designed to help people think through whether a plastic item is likely to be single-use and therefore included in the ban.
Yeah.
This is a good opportunity to mention that we are asking suppliers and retailers to think about how they can increase reusability and reduce waste. Definitely, shifting to reuse is a really excellent way to tackle the top of the waste hierarchy and reduce the production of raw materials in the first place. So really encourage retailers to think, do they need to keep supplying the plastic item, especially if customers are likely to use the item once and throw it away. Could also be useful just to note the New Zealand Commerce Commission, they've released guidance on substantiating environmental claims. So that could be something to look through to make sure that you have reasonable grounds for claims, for example, around single use and reuse.
Yeah, perfect. And so I guess that kind of also brings to the tricky thing is that some businesses, despite the fact that we've, there's been some clear signals on where this is going and that, but also sometimes that information hasn't really been, obtained or things like that. So some businesses may have excess stock on banned items. What are they able to do with it?
Yeah, great question. We definitely have heard from some businesses around excess stock. So there's a few different kind of avenues to explore in that situation. So, for example, with produce bags, is it possible for businesses to pre-package certain fruit or vegetables that requires pre-packaging, using some of those produce bags to be sold pre-packaged on shelves? Plastic straws, they could go to a disability support centre, or they could be sent offshore or resold offshore to keep the plastic straws for own personal use. Think about picnics or parties or lunch boxes to avoid the straws going straight to landfill.
Yeah.
And then for cutlery, businesses might contact their suppliers to see if they would be willing to provide an alternative compliance stock, or the business, if the business were to send back their remaining excess stock to take to your local recycling centre to see if they can accept items for recycling. And
so in regards to that, so obviously we're getting into the businesses, but also it can be a bit confusing for consumers. What's available for businesses to share with consumers to help them understand these decisions and why they're supplying certain things or selling certain items?
There's a huge amount of resources available on our website to support businesses in that space. So again, there's the main guidance page, which I mentioned earlier, but there's also, you could access fact sheets, posters, and we've got some translated material on there into some different languages. In addition, our compliance team at the ministry has been really busy over the last few months out there visiting businesses across the Motu and handing out hard copies of these resources to businesses. As you mentioned, we've partnered with Retail New Zealand, and you've also been working to support businesses with their queries as they've been coming through. So that's really encouraged people to call either the ministry's free 0800 number to ask questions and get advice, or they can also email at plastics@mfe.gov.nz, and we will answer questions as soon as we can.
Yeah, so like you said, there's compliance and things like that. So of course, this is a ban. So can you talk us through about how this is enforced?
We'll generally take an educational approach to enforcement in the first instance, really focused on ensuring there's a good level of understanding about the bans and what they mean for each individual business. And so offering advice to help businesses understand their responsibilities. Of course, we will take enforcement action where that's appropriate, particularly where there is systemic or ongoing non-compliance. Parties that contravene the Waste Minimisation Act 2008 can face prosecution and fines of up to $100,000 per offence. But as I mentioned, in the first instance, this is really about ensuring there's a good level of awareness out there.
Yeah, and that awareness is really important, right? But also there is a third tranche coming. How can businesses prepare?
Yeah, so the way that we've designed these three tranches or these three phases of plastic bans has really been starting off, these bans started off on the 1st of October last year in 2022. And as you mentioned, there's a third tranche coming, and they've really been designed to start with some of the items where many businesses and consumers were familiar with shifting away from those products. So they were a bit more straightforward. And in the third tranche, we're looking to remove some of these particularly hard to recycle plastic types. So from mid-2025, the government will ban all other PVC and polystyrene food and beverage packaging. So that all other is referring to the back to the 1st of October bans from last year, where we started off with a couple of the PVC and polystyrene food and beverage packaging, but from mid-2025 it will be all other. Currently what we're working through is engaging with the sector and affected parties to understand what the key challenges might be in that shift, and also what the opportunities are to work with the sector. So we're aiming to have regulations finalised around mid next year, to ensure the sector has plenty of certainty, at least a year before that ban would come into force, where they can see the regulations and make sure they're taking steps to be compliant from mid-2025. So would really encourage anyone to reach out to us if they'd like to discuss the third tranche. We're really keen to hear from businesses. So in terms of the future phase outs, kind of, what goes beyond mid-2025, the government isn't ruling any future phase outs out, but at the moment the focus is really on still implementing tranche 2 and then working towards that third tranche. So the items in the third tranche, as I mentioned, are a bit more challenging, and so really taking the time to hear from everyone that will be affected.
And from a retail incentive pack, like obviously that is a really challenging type of plastic. I mean, and we can see that, there is some work that needs to be done there, whether, like you said, there's a phase out, but also I know, because I sit on the EPS steering group around the creating a kind of circular economy for that, there is other work that's going on in that sense of things. Can you talk to me about we've got a few bans, we've got some other recently announced changes in this space to kind of get New Zealand in the space about how we're recycling and that, like the curbside standardization. Can you give us a bit of overall view of kind of that future state or what's going on?
Yes, as you say, the plastic phase outs, they're part of a wider government work program, waste reduction work program, and also specifically part of the government's National Plastics Action Plan, which was released back in 2021, which is as I say, it's part of our wider waste work program to shift New Zealand towards a lower waste, lower emissions, circular economy. We're making changes to standardise the materials collected at curbside across Aotearoa, and so for plastics specifically, that will include plastic types 1, so PET, plastic type 2, HDPE, and plastic type 5, polypropylene, and it will exclude plastic types 3 and 6, so PVC and polystyrene, and that is consistent with the direction we're taking with these phase outs, as we've been talking about through this. So the ministry's work includes working with industry as well to develop a regulated product stewardship scheme for plastic packaging, and also for farm plastics, as well as a $50 million plastics innovation fund to help rethink and reimagine the way that we make, use and dispose of plastics. So there's a lot of work happening in the space, and also, as I mentioned right back at the start, some of my work also includes working with MFAT on New Zealand's participation towards a global plastics treaty. So that's it'll be really interesting to see where that heads over the next couple of years and what the implications might be domestically for New Zealand.
Yeah. I mean, there is a lot going on and a lot to digest there in that sense of things. So thank you for taking us time to talk it through. Is there anything you missed that you'd like to add to share with anyone?
No, I think you're right. We've covered a lot of ground and there's a lot of information out there. So just encourage, if there's any additional questions that have popped out of this, please get in touch with the ministry. And as we mentioned, Retail New Zealand as well, helping to support this rollout. So.
Yeah, and exactly as Daisy mentioned, you can pick up the phone and you can call Plastics Hotline, and that's 0800 472 472, but also you can search plastics on the Retail NZ website, which is www.retail.kiwi, and you will get a load of information, and as with the ministry's website in that sense of things. Thanks, Daisy. It was great to have you, and I'm sure it will help people businesses understand what's going on here.
Thanks so much for having me.